On the evening of June the 29th, 2013, 25-year-old Lindsay Ashton was attacked inside her own home in Winton, Salford, in a beating that lasted roughly an hour. By the time it was over, she had suffered more than 100 separate injuries. Her attacker had kicked her, punched her, hit her with a metal pole, cut her with a knife, and finally strangled her with a cable tie. He then left her body for her own relatives to find and disappeared. For nearly a month, police across Greater Manchester searched for him, while Lindsay's two young daughters were left without their mother. And while a much darker question quietly started circulating among investigators, family members, and eventually the wider public who followed the case in local news coverage, as the manhunt dragged on week after week with no sign of an arrest. Because this wasn't the first time anyone had heard Michael Cope's name in connection with Lindsay Ashton. Weeks before he killed her, she had already gone to the police herself, terrified, telling them in her own words that she thought he was going to kill her. What happened between that warning and her death is one of the most damning examples of a domestic abuse case slipping through the cracks that British policing has ever had to publicly account for. And by the end of this story, you'll understand exactly why an official police watchdog ended up opening a formal investigation into how this case, and two others just like it, were handled before it was too late. Before we get into this case, take 1 second to hit subscribe. More than 90% of the people watching still aren't subscribed, and if you enjoy real true crime built from court records, police files, and verified reporting, not rumors or made-up drama, you'll love what's coming next. So subscribe now, give this video a like, and help us keep bringing you more real cases every week. Now, let's go back to who Lindsay Ashton really was, and how Michael Cope became the man she feared most, despite her repeated attempts to get police to protect her. Like so many relationships that eventually turn abusive, the one between Lindsay and Cope wasn't a simple, unbroken decline from the very beginning. It was on-off, meaning periods where the two of them separated and periods where they reconciled, a pattern that domestic abuse advocates often point to as one of the hardest dynamics to intervene in from the outside, because each breakup can look, to friends and family, like the relationship is finally over for good, right up until it starts again. And each reconciliation can quietly reset the clock on how seriously outsiders take the danger the relationship actually poses. According to the prosecution's account, delivered by Kate Blackwell QC at Manchester Crown Court, the relationship between Lindsay and Cope had been marked by months of physical violence and domestic abuse before it ever reached its final, fatal conclusion. Blackwell walked the court through incident after incident, building a picture not of a single bad night, but of an escalating, sustained pattern of control and violence that had defined much of Lindsay and Cope's time together. On one earlier occasion, Cope had strangled Lindsay until she lost consciousness. When she woke up, according to the account given in court, he told her plainly that he was going to kill her, adding that he would gladly do the time for it, that he actually liked it in prison. It's the kind of statement that, heard in isolation, might sound like empty bravado from an angry partner in the heat of an argument. In hindsight, given what came next, it reads as something closer to an explicit warning that almost nobody with the power to intervene took seriously enough. What makes that particular exchange so haunting in retrospect is how specific it was. Cope wasn't vaguely threatening her the way an argument sometimes spills into exaggerated language neither party really means. He was describing in advance exactly the calculation he was making, that a prison sentence for killing her wouldn't be a deterrent at all, simply a cost he'd already decided he was willing to pay. In the weeks before her death, Lindsay did exactly what victims of domestic abuse are so often told to do. She went to Greater Manchester Police. She reported that Cope had headbutted her in public and threatened to kill her. She told officers, in words that were later read aloud in court, that Cope had said he didn't give a damn if he killed her, because he had more to lose than she did. She described her fear with chilling clarity, telling police that now that she'd reported him, She believed he would simply think that if he was going to prison anyway, he might as well actually go through with hurting her. She said she was scared of him coming to get her, and that until he was behind bars, she wasn't going to be okay. That statement, preserved and later read out in a courtroom, stands as one of the most direct and specific pieces of evidence in the entire case. A woman explicitly predicting the exact mechanism of her own potential murder, weeks before it actually happened. It's worth pausing on just how much detail Lindsay provided in that report. She wasn't offering a vague sense of unease or a general complaint about a difficult relationship. She was describing a specific psychological calculation she believed her abuser had already made, that reporting him to police wouldn't protect her. It would simply remove any remaining incentive for him to hold back. That warning turned out to be tragically accurate. But in the weeks that followed her report, Cope wasn't arrested and taken off the streets in the way Lindsay had hoped. He remained free, and according to what later emerged, roughly 2 weeks before he killed her, Cope had actually attempted to turn himself in. A solicitor representing him contacted an officer within Greater Manchester Police's Public Protection Investigations Unit, explaining that Cope wanted to surrender himself and was currently waiting at a law firm in Manchester city centre. According to the account that later came to light, police responded by telling the solicitor they did not want to speak to him at that stage. Whatever opportunity existed in that moment to bring Cope into custody, at a point when he was voluntarily presenting himself rather than being hunted down, was allowed to pass. It's difficult to overstate how significant that single decision would come to look in hindsight. Here was a man wanted in connection with an alleged rape and assault against the very woman who had already told officers she feared for her life, and rather than being brought in and processed while he was sitting, cooperatively, inside a solicitor's office waiting to be collected, he was told, in effect, that police weren't ready for him yet. He walked back out of that office a free man, and 2 weeks later, Lindsay Ashton was dead. 2 weeks after that missed opportunity, on the evening of June the 29th, 2013, Michael Cope went to Lindsay Ashton's home in Winton. What followed was, in the words used at his eventual sentencing, a savage and sustained attack on a defenseless woman in her own home. Over the course of roughly an hour, Cope subjected Lindsay to sustained, escalating violence. He kicked her. He punched her. He beat her with a metal pole. He used a knife against her. And ultimately, he strangled her to death using a cable tie. By the time it was over, a post-mortem examination would identify 108 separate injuries across her body, a figure so high that, when it was later read aloud in court, it visibly shook the roughly 40 family members and friends who had gathered to hear the case against her killer. An hour is a long time for any assault to continue uninterrupted, long enough that the violence inside that house wasn't the product of a single explosive loss of temper, but something closer to a sustained, methodical infliction of harm that continued well past the point where any single blow could be explained away as an accident of rage. After killing her, Cope didn't call for help and he didn't stay at the scene. He left Lindsay's body behind for her own family members to discover, and then he disappeared entirely. What followed was a manhunt that stretched across Greater Manchester for close to a month, with police actively searching for a man they already knew had a documented history of violence against the very woman he just killed, and who had, weeks earlier, explicitly warned that he might do exactly this. For Lindsay's 2 young daughters, that month meant living without their mother and without any resolution, while the man responsible remained free somewhere in the region. For the wider community in Salford and across Greater Manchester, it meant a month of uncertainty as well, with a man known to be dangerous and known to police, still unaccounted for. Cope was eventually located and arrested at an address in Lee, Greater Manchester, following the extended search. Upon his arrest, he reportedly told officers he was glad it was over, and admitted that he had attempted to hang himself at some point while on the run, but had been unable to go through with it. Whatever combination of guilt, exhaustion, or fear of capture had built up over those weeks on the run, it clearly hadn't been enough to bring him forward voluntarily the way his solicitor had once offered on his behalf, weeks before Lindsay's death. It's a strange, uncomfortable detail to sit with. A man who had once tried to hand himself in before he'd killed anyone, only to spend nearly a month evading capture after he actually had, apparently reaching some kind of breaking point of his own before officers finally caught up with him in Lee, a town roughly 10 miles from the home in Winton where Lindsay had died weeks earlier. The case reached Manchester Crown Court in January of 2014. Rather than proceeding to a full contested trial, Cope entered guilty pleas at the very start of proceedings, admitting to murder along with 3 separate counts of assault occasioning actual bodily harm. A single charge of rape, connected to an earlier incident involving Lindsay, was ordered to lie on file, a legal outcome that means the charge remains formally on record without being separately prosecuted, typically because the defendant has already admitted to a more serious offense covering the same underlying conduct. By pleading guilty rather than contesting the charges, Cope spared Lindsay's family the experience of sitting through a full trial in which every detail of that hour-long attack would have been laid out in open court, though it also meant the case never received the same kind of extended public scrutiny and cross-examination that a contested murder trial typically generates, leaving many of the surrounding questions about the police response to be pursued separately. Through the watchdog investigation, rather than through evidence tested in the courtroom itself. Sentencing took place the following day, on January the 21st, 2014. Mr. Justice Parker, presiding over the case, did not mince words in describing what Cope had done. He told him directly that he had set out in a most deliberate and calculating manner to kill his victim, and that what had happened inside Lindsay's home amounted to a savage and sustained attack on a defenseless woman, carried out in the one place she should have been safest. Michael Cope was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 27 years to serve before he can even be considered for parole, meaning he will not be eligible for release until he is in his mid-50s at the earliest. Reports from inside the courtroom that day described Cope as smirking as the sentence was handed down, a detail that struck many observers as strikingly at odds with the gravity of what had just been read aloud. In a room filled with roughly 40 of Lindsay's own grieving family and friends, many of whom had traveled to be there specifically to see the man responsible finally held accountable in front of a judge. In the aftermath of the sentencing, Superintendent Wayne Miller of Greater Manchester Police spoke publicly about the case, describing Lindsay's family as remaining heartbroken by what had happened. He said Cope had not only taken away a life in its prime, but had deprived 2 young girls of their mother, and that he had carried out a brutal murder before leaving relatives to find her body themselves. He said the level of violence involved had been shocking, and that nobody deserved such a fate. He acknowledged that Lindsay had suffered a history of domestic abuse at Cope's hands, describing him as someone who had wanted to manipulate and control her, and noted that Cope had already been wanted by police at the time he carried out the killing. Miller added that the force continued to learn lessons about how to better protect victims of domestic abuse and give them the confidence to come forward and report what was happening to them, while the force awaited the outcome of the ongoing watchdog investigation into how Lindsay's own earlier reports had actually been handled. That last comment pointed toward something far larger than Cope's individual sentencing, because Lindsay's case didn't end with his conviction. In the days after the killing, it emerged that Greater Manchester Police had received a report from Lindsay herself, describing rape and assault at Cope's hands in the weeks immediately before her murder. The revelation that Cope's own solicitor had tried to arrange his surrender to police 2 weeks before the killing, only to be told officers didn't want to speak to him at that stage, raised serious and uncomfortable questions about whether Lindsay's death might have been prevented entirely. had that opportunity been taken instead of declined. The Independent Police Complaints Commission opened an investigation into how Greater Manchester Police had handled its dealings with Lindsay Ashton in the lead-up to her death, beginning just 2 days after she was killed. That investigation didn't examine her case in isolation. It was eventually folded into a broader review covering 3 separate women, Lindsay Ashton, Rania Alade, and Farkhanda Younis, all of whom had suffered domestic violence and were killed in 2013, and all of whom had had some prior contact with Greater Manchester Police before their deaths. Grouping 3 separate domestic homicide cases into a single combined review was, by the watchdog's own account, an unprecedented decision, reflecting just how seriously the pattern across all 3 deaths was being taken, even as it meant no single family got a dedicated, standalone report addressing exactly what had happened in their own case. The scale of that combined investigation, and the fact that it took years for its findings to be published at all, became its own source of public criticism, with campaigners and journalists pressing for transparency about exactly what had gone wrong in each case, and what, if anything, had genuinely changed as a result. Years after Lindsay's murder, members of the public were still submitting freedom of information requests, simply trying to find out why a watchdog investigation opened within days of her death still hadn't produced a public report, a delay that left her family, and the families of the other 2 women covered by the same review, waiting for answers about exactly how the system had failed the people they loved. In the years since her death, Lindsay Ashton has been remembered by her community in ways that extended well beyond the courtroom. A charity football match was organized in her memory, drawing boxing champion Ricky Hatton, who led a team made up of police officers, firefighters, and probation workers against a side of former Manchester City players, with proceeds going to victim support, an organization dedicated to helping people affected by crime rebuild their lives. It was a small but meaningful gesture from a community determined not to let Lindsay become simply another statistic in a domestic violence case file, but to keep her memory and the lessons of what happened to her visible. The choice to involve police officers and firefighters directly in that memorial match, standing alongside the same kind of emergency services that Lindsay herself had once turned to for protection, added a layer of meaning that went beyond simple fundraising, a public acknowledgement that the system meant to protect people like her still had work to do, work that her own family, her friends, and the officers who took part that day all seemed determined to keep visible rather than quietly forgotten once the headlines moved on. For Lindsay's family, speaking after Cope's sentencing, there was a measure of relief that the legal process had finally reached its conclusion, sparing them from having to sit through a full trial and hear every detail of how she had suffered. They described the previous year as the most traumatic of their lives, and said that, while nothing would ever replace her, they could at last begin to find some closure, remembering her as a beautiful, wonderful, caring person who had left behind 2 young daughters who would always be reminded of exactly what kind of mother they had lost. What remains far harder to resolve is the question sitting underneath the entire case, not whether Michael Cope was guilty, which was never seriously in doubt once the evidence was laid out, but whether a woman who had done everything she was supposed to do, reporting her abuser, describing her fear in explicit and specific terms, and warning that his own words suggested he might genuinely try to kill her, should have ever been left in a position where those warnings simply weren't enough to keep her alive. It's a question that outlived the trial itself, one that continued to be asked long after Michael Cope was sent to begin serving his 27-year minimum term, in the form of a still unpublished watchdog report that Lindsay's family, years on, were still waiting to see, hoping it might finally explain, in detail, exactly what had gone wrong between her first call for help and the night that call went unanswered. If you found this case informative, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story. Leave a like if you appreciate factual, well-researched cases, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next case.